But I only had a text off him the day before. It just seemed unreal, you know.
It started with a shake in Tony Iommi's voice, the way his eyes dropped to the floor, like he was trying to find the right word somewhere in the carpet. 77 years old, he said almost himself, and I still can't believe he's gone. For a man who'd stood beside Ozzy Osbourne in the loudest, wildest storms rock music had ever produced.
But yeah, it meant everything to him. It was this is what we built up for that big ending where he could see all the people, and we could all see all the people, and close it in that way, you know. But we didn't expect to close it so quick with us. We didn't expect him to go, you know, that quick, really.
Tony had seen it all. The fights, the laughter, the overdoses, the miracles, the kind of madness that would destroy most people in a week, but somehow became their normal. And now, in front of the cameras, he was blinking back tears as he tried to explain what it was about Ozzy that made him both impossible to live with and impossible to live without. He was just Ozzy, Tony finally said, like that was the only explanation you could give to someone who hadn't lived it. And maybe it was, because he could stack up every headline, every insane story, and still not get close to what it meant to know him.
It was always funny. Ozzy was Ozzy. There's never going to be another Ozzy. He's the only one that's one Ozzy, and that's it. Just a special person, just the way he is.
The man was chaos wrapped in leather, capable of making you howl with laughter in one moment and want to strangle him the next. But somehow he got away with all of it because he had this glint in his eye, the one that said he was in on the joke, even if the joke was on himself. Tony laughed through the tears as he remembered one night in the early days of Black Sabbath. After a gig in Germany, Ozzy had gone missing, completely vanished, and the crew were in a panic. Hours later, they found him in a stranger's kitchen, making himself a sandwich like he owned the place. He wandered off drunk, followed the smell of food, and when the startled homeowner asked what the hell he was doing, Ozzy just said, "I'm the singer," as if that explained everything. That was Ozzy logic. If it made sense to him, it didn't matter if the rest of the world thought it was insane.
Yeah, he seemed all right. He enjoyed it.
There was the infamous dove incident. Everyone knows the bat story, but Tony swears the doves were worse. It was supposed to be a publicity stunt at a record label meeting. Ozzy was meant to release 2 white doves as a symbol of peace. Instead, bored and slightly buzzed, he bit the head off one right there in front of horrified executives. The room froze. Sharon was mortified. Ozzy just shrugged and said, "Well, it's not flying now, is it?"
Family and kids by the pool. Well, I'm talking like a nice 4 or 5-star hotel. Ozzy's like, I gotta fucking pee. He just whips out his and is peeing at the Four Seasons pool. I look over, I see moms grabbing their kids, covering their eyes and going, "Come on, honey, let's go."
The stories piled up like wreckage behind him. The time he tried to dry his wet clothes in a hotel microwave. The night he showed up at Tony's door wearing a dress because he lost a bet and decided to go shopping in Birmingham like that. The tour in the 70s where he smuggled a small dog onto the bus, convinced it was his lucky charm, and refused to go on stage unless the dog was sitting in the wings. People always asked how Sharon put up with it, but the truth was, she was just as much a part of the madness. Tony remembered nights on the road when Sharon would storm into the dressing room, dragging Ozzy by the ear like a schoolboy, shouting at him for sneaking out to party with fans. And Ozzy, eyes wide and innocent, would say, "They were lonely, Sharon. I was being polite." Then there were the arguments, the ones that could turn a hotel suite into rubble in under 10 minutes. Once, after a fight in Japan, Ozzy tossed every piece of furniture out a 10th-floor window. Sharon checked him out the next morning like nothing had happened. And yet, under all that chaos, there were these flashes of pure humanity that no one could fake. Tony told the story of a night when he'd been so low, so homesick, he thought about quitting the band. Ozzy sat with him until dawn, no jokes, no madness, just listening.
But he would also say, "Do you guys have any drugs?" And we'd be like, "No, Ozzy, no drugs." "You got any beer?" "No." "You got any pills?" "No." "You got any cocaine?" "No." And he goes, "Man, you're boring."
That was Ozzy. He could be the reason you wanted to run away and the reason you stayed, all in the same breath. The gossip never stopped, not in the band, not in the tabloids. There were the affairs whispered about, denied, admitted, denied again, and the nights lost to benders so wild no one could piece them back together the next day. There was a time in the 80s when he disappeared for 2 days in Los Angeles and came back with a new tattoo, a random parrot, and a story about accidentally joining someone's family barbecue. No one knew if it was true, but with Ozzy, truth was optional. On the road, he was a prankster on a warpath. He once replaced all of Tony's clothes with identical pairs of women's leggings just to see how long it would take him to notice.
A rock star one time said to me, I opened, he said, "Is there anyone out there?" I said, like 19,000 people. You smell the WD-40. That's how they got the last 1,000 people in. Are you kidding? He said, I'm always worried that no one's going to show up. I said, when has that ever been your problem?
He glued Bill Ward's drumsticks to the stage before a show. He had Geezer Butler's shoes in a hotel freezer. And when he got bored of tormenting the band, he'd turn on the crew, swapping their luggage tags, changing their wake-up calls to 3 a.m., convincing one poor guy that the tour bus was haunted. But it wasn't all fun and games. Tony's voice cracked again when he spoke about the darker times. The overdoses, the hospital runs, the moments when it seemed certain they'd lose him. Ozzy had 9 lives, he said, and I think he used all of them twice. He remembered once finding Ozzy passed out in a hallway, breathing shallow, and shaking him awake with pure panic in his chest. Ozzy opened one eye, grinned, and said, "Not yet, mate." And then there was the bat. Everyone knows the headline. Ozzy bites the head off a bat on stage. But Tony swears the best part was what happened after. He thought it was rubber, Tony said. Then he realized it wasn't, and we had to rush him to get rabies shots. He was more annoyed about missing the after party than getting the injections. Sharon was there for all of it, and if she wasn't laughing, she was screaming.
Jesus Christ!
Yeah, who's just one of my favorite people. He's another guy.
Is anyone out
He's
there?
honest.
How many people?
Hey, man, is anyone out there, man? And I said, are you kidding?
Tony remembered a family holiday where Ozzy insisted on renting a boat even though he had no idea how to operate one. Within an hour, they'd run aground, Ozzy shirtless at the wheels shouting, "I'm the captain," while Sharon threatened to swim back to shore and leave him there. The kids grew up in this circus, used to camera as chaos, and the constant whiplash of Ozzy being the most embarrassing and most lovable dad in the world. Kelly once told Tony that her friends never believed half her childhood stories because they sounded too insane. But to the Osbournes, that was just Tuesday. As Tony talked, the stories spilled faster, like he was afraid if he stopped, the silence would crush him. He spoke about the backstage drinking games, the way Ozzy would break into song at the worst possible moment, the times he'd walk into rehearsal with some ridiculous idea. Let's do the whole set wearing giant rabbit costumes. And somehow talked him into trying it. He told the gossip about Ozzy buying a car just because he liked the horn sound, about the feud with a neighbor over a lawn ornament shaped like a gargoyle, about the time he wandered into the wrong wedding and stayed long enough to make a speech. And when Tony finally stopped, eyes red and voice low, he said the thing that broke everyone watching. There'll never be another Ozzy. You couldn't make one like him. And God help you if you tried.
Goes nuts. The show is great.
Of course.
And I said, you worry about people don't show up? I get really depressed, man. And I went, okay.
Tony leaned back in his chair for a moment, rubbing his face like he was trying to steady himself. But the memories kept coming unstoppable now. You know, he said, Ozzy could make trouble out of thin air. You'd think he was sitting there, minding his own business. And then suddenly you're in the middle of some ridiculous scene you couldn't have imagined 5 minutes before. There was a time in New York when they were all staying at the Plaza Hotel. It was meant to be a quiet night before a big show. Tony was in his room watching TV when there was a knock on the door. He opened it to find Ozzy standing there in a bathrobe, holding a live lobster. "Sharon's mad at me," Ozzy said. "Can I keep this in your tub at night?" Tony didn't even ask where it had come from. By the next morning, Ozzy was gone and so was the lobster. No one ever saw it again. That was Ozzy. Things appeared, things disappeared, and the explanations were always worse than the mystery. On tour in South America, they'd finished the show and were all heading back to the hotel when Ozzy vanished from the convoy. Everyone thought maybe he'd gone with some fans, but no. 2 hours later, he came strolling into the lobby soaking wet, holding his shoes in his hand, with a story about falling into a fountain while chasing the moon. He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. But it wasn't always silly chaos. Sometimes it was spectacularly expensive chaos. Tony remembered the Japan incident. Ozzy decided he wanted a souvenir, but not something small. He came back to the hotel with an antique suit of samurai armor he'd bought for an obscene amount of money. Sharon nearly had a stroke trying to figure out how to get it home. It ended up shipped in its own crate, and for years it stood in their hallway like some silent witness to his impulses. The thing is, the impulse could be good or bad. Sometimes he'd buy a ridiculous gift for a friend just because he thought it was funny. One year, Tony got a Christmas present from Ozzy, a huge taxidermy owl, perched in a glass case with a little plaque that read to Tone, "From the Prince of Darkness." "Where'd you even get this?" Tony had asked. Ozzy just shrugged. "I know a guy, and it was always a guy for owls, a guy for fireworks at 3 a.m, a guy who could get you a baby goat for the weekend." Sharon once told Tony she spent half her marriage dealing with these guys. Then Tony laughed again, remembering a moment from the early MTV reality show days. The cameras were rolling in the kitchen. Sharon was talking about something mundane, and in the background Ozzy was trying to make tea. Only he didn't realize the kettle wasn't plugged in. 10 minutes later, he's shouting, "Sharon, the water's broken." She didn't even turn around, just said, "No, Ozzy, you're broken." That was the thing about Sharon. She could match him punch for punch, and sometimes she was the only one who could get him pause. The press always wanted the big stories, the bat, the booze, the rehab, but Tony liked the small ones too, like how Ozzy would hum to himself constantly, little bits of melodies no one else knew, even in the middle of conversations, or how he couldn't resist a dare, no matter how stupid. One night, after a gig, someone bet him he couldn't jump into the hotel pool fully clothed. Not only did he do it, he dragged 3 other people in with him and emerged holding someone's wallet, which he claimed had just been there. There were wild years when the band didn't know if he'd make it to the next tour, years when Sharon was the only thing holding him together. Tony remembered one night in the 80s when Ozzy, drunk and emotional, stood on a balcony in Miami declaring he was going to fly like a bat into the ocean. It took 3 people to talk him down. "You be dead," Tony told him. Ozzy just grinned. "Not if I land on a shark first." And yet, there were these incredible, grounding moments that reminded you he was more than the mayhem. Tony told of visiting Ozzy in the hospital once, after one of his more serious injuries. The room was quiet, machines humming. Sharon sitting in the corner looking exhausted. Ozzy looked up at Tony and said, "Tone, if I go, make sure my funeral's not boring." Tony promised he wouldn't. "I mean it," Ozzy said. "I want fireworks." And midgets dress as bats. They laughed, but the truth was, if you knew Ozzy, you knew he meant it. Backstage gossip could fill a book. The time he nearly missed a flight because he was arguing with airport security about why his carry-on was too important to scan. The carry-on in question being a small jar of dirt from his garden at home. Or the night he walked into the wrong hotel room, saw a stranger asleep in bed, and climbed in thinking it was Sharon. The stranger screamed, Ozzy screamed, and somehow he still managed to walk out with a handful of the guy's snacks from the minibar. Fans would send him the weirdest things, and he loved it. Once someone mailed him a massive homemade quilt with his face stitched in the middle, surrounded by little bats. He actually slept under for months until Sharon insisted it was creepy and replaced it with something less. Ozzy. And then there were the animals. Always the animals.
He's like, oh, Rob, I want to play you my new record. So he puts on his new record. I think he's going to play one song. He plays the whole album, looking directly at me.
Monkeys, dogs, cats, once even a tarantula. The crew dreaded it when Ozzy made friends with a local street dog because it meant they'd be smuggling it onto the bus somehow. He'd sit there feeding it bits of his dinner, telling about the gig like it was another band member. If anyone tried to move the dog, he'd say, "Leave him, he's part of the family now." And sometimes he meant it. More than one tour ended with Ozzy bringing home a new family member for Sharon to meet.